Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. On Halloween morning, 1979, a road crew in Georgetown, Texas, made a chilling discovery: the body of a young woman wearing nothing but a pair of orange socks. For 40 years, she remained nameless, known only by this single piece of clothing, while a notorious serial killer's false confession further muddied the waters of justice. But in 2019, DNA technology finally gave her back her identity: 23-year-old Deborah Jackson. Tonight, we'll explore how a single pair of orange socks became the key to one of Texas's most perplexing cold cases, and the devastating truth that lay hidden for 4 decades. Let's begin. On a cold Halloween morning in 1979, a road crew worker made a disturbing discovery that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. Just off Interstate 35 in Georgetown, Texas, lying face down in a concrete culvert, was the body of a young woman. She was wearing nothing but a pair of orange socks, which would become her identifying moniker for the next 40 years. The location where she was found was remote, yet accessible. The kind of place someone with local knowledge might choose to dispose of a body. The culvert was situated near mile marker 266 on northbound Interstate 35 between Georgetown and Jarrell. It was a spot where passing motorists wouldn't notice anything amiss, but where rain would eventually wash away evidence. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found the victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been dead for less than 24 hours when she was discovered. She had defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she had fought for her life. Her body showed signs of having been dragged, with scrapes and bruises consistent with being pulled across the rough concrete of the culvert. The young woman was estimated to be between 15 and 30 years old, stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall, and weighed approximately 135 to 140 pounds. She had long brown hair with a reddish tint and hazel eyes. There were several distinctive features about her. She had a vaccination scar on her upper left arm, and her toenails were painted a striking shade of red. But perhaps most notably, she had a small caliber gunshot wound scar on her upper back, which had healed long before her death. Detective Jim Boutwell of the Williamson County Sheriff's Office took the lead on the case. In those pre-DNA days, investigators had precious few tools at their disposal. They took her fingerprints and photographs, documented her dental work, and collected what physical evidence they could from the scene. But with no identification on the body and no missing persons reports matching her description, they had little to go on. The orange socks themselves became a crucial piece of evidence. They were tube socks, relatively common, but investigators hoped they might provide some clue to her identity or where she had been before her death. They were the only items of clothing found with her body, leading investigators to believe her other clothes had been taken by her killer or disposed of elsewhere. The case garnered significant local media attention. News outlets broadcast her description and composite sketches, hoping someone would recognize her. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, no one came forward to claim her. She became known simply as Orange Socks, a name that would stick with her for 4 decades. In 1982, the case took a dramatic turn when notorious serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to her murder. Lucas, who would eventually confess to hundreds of murders across the country, provided details about the crime that seemed to match the evidence. He claimed he had picked up the woman hitchhiking in Oklahoma and killed her after she refused his sexual advances. Lucas's confession seemed like a breakthrough, but there were problems from the start. He was known for falsely confessing to murders he hadn't committed, often to gain special privileges in prison or to avoid more serious charges. He would later admit that he had fabricated many of his confessions, including potentially the Orange Socks murder. Despite the doubts surrounding his confession, Lucas was convicted of the Orange Socks murder in 1984 and sentenced to death. The conviction rested largely on his confession and his ability to describe details about the crime scene. However, work records later showed that Lucas had likely been working in Florida on the day of the murder, making it virtually impossible for him to have committed the crime in Texas. The questionable nature of Lucas's conviction highlighted a growing problem in criminal justice: the reliability of confessions. Studies would later show that false confessions were far more common than previously thought, especially in cases where suspects were subjected to lengthy interrogations or offered incentives to confess. As the years passed, the true identity of Orange Socks remained a mystery. She became one of the thousands of unidentified victims in America's cold case files, her true name unknown, her family unaware of her fate. But advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA technology and genetic genealogy, would eventually provide new tools for investigators to unlock the secrets of who she really was. In the late 1990s, investigators exhumed her body to collect DNA samples, hoping that future technological advances might help identify her. They also created a more detailed composite sketch using forensic artistry techniques that hadn't been available in 1979. Her case was entered into NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, where it became case number UP44477. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough finally came. Using genetic genealogy, the same technique that had recently helped solve the Golden State Killer case, investigators were able to build a family tree using DNA from the victim. This new approach combined traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research, allowing investigators to trace family connections through public genetic databases and historical records. The genetic genealogy work was painstaking, requiring months of careful research and verification. Investigators had to trace multiple family lines, looking for intersections that might lead them to their unidentified victim. They were searching for someone who had disappeared in the late 1970s, someone whose family might never have known what happened to her. The breakthrough came when investigators identified a family line in Abilene, Texas. Through careful analysis and cross-referencing of records, they finally put a name to the woman who had been known only as Orange Socks for 40 years. Deborah Jackson. She was 23 years old when she died, and she had left her home in Abilene in 1977, 2 years before her death. The identification of Deborah Jackson opened up new avenues of investigation and revealed a tragic story of a young woman's life cut short. Born in 1956, Deborah had worked at a nursing home in Abilene before disappearing. She had suffered from mental health issues, which may explain why no missing persons report was ever filed. Her family had simply believed she had chosen to leave and start a new life elsewhere. The gunshot wound scar that investigators had noted in 1979 was finally explained. Family members revealed that Deborah had been accidentally shot when she was younger, confirming this distinctive marking that had been documented in the original autopsy. This detail served as additional confirmation of her identity, along with the DNA evidence. When investigators dug deeper into Deborah's life, they discovered she had been living a transient lifestyle in the years before her death. She had been seen in various Texas cities, working occasional jobs and sometimes hitchhiking between locations. This matched with what little was known about her final movements, but it also made tracking her last days more challenging. The identification of Deborah Jackson cast further doubt on Henry Lee Lucas's confession. While Lucas had claimed he picked up his victim in Oklahoma, evidence suggested Deborah had been in Texas in the days leading up to her death. This was just one more inconsistency in Lucas's story, adding to the mountain of evidence that his confession had been false. Lucas's death sentence for the Orange Socks murder had been commuted to life imprisonment in 1998 by then-Governor George W. Bush due to doubts about his guilt. It would be the only death sentence Bush commuted during his time as governor. Lucas died in prison in 2001, having never provided any reliable information about who really killed Deborah Jackson. The false confession in this case highlighted a disturbing pattern in Lucas's criminal history. During the early 1980s, he had confessed to hundreds of unsolved murders across the country. Many of these confessions were later proven false, but not before they had derailed numerous investigations and provided false closure to grieving families. Lucas's interrogation techniques became a subject of study for law enforcement and criminal justice researchers. He was often provided with crime scene photos and details before giving his confessions, which explained how he could describe crimes he hadn't committed. He was also given special privileges, including strawberry milkshakes and preferential treatment, in exchange for his confessions. The task force that had been formed to investigate Lucas's claims, known as the Lucas Task Force, had been criticized for accepting his confessions too readily. Critics argued that investigators had been more interested in clearing cases than in finding the truth. The Orange Socks case became a prime example of how a false confession could lead investigators astray and allow the real killer to escape justice. With Deborah Jackson's identification, investigators could finally begin to piece together her last movements. They learned that she had been seen in Amarillo and Austin in the months before her death. She had worked briefly at a Ramada Inn in Austin, though employment records from that period were long gone. Witnesses remembered her as quiet and hard-working, giving no indication that she sensed any danger. The discovery of her identity also revealed why no one had come forward to identify her in 1979. Her family, believing she had chosen to leave, hadn't been looking for her. The composite sketches released at the time hadn't reached Abilene, or if they had, no one had made the connection. It was a tragic example of how someone could vanish without anyone realizing they were missing. Deborah's family finally received answers about what had happened to their loved one, but those answers brought new grief. For 40 years, they had imagined her living somewhere, perhaps with a new family of her own. Instead, they learned she had been murdered just 2 years after leaving home. The years of not knowing had been replaced with a devastating truth. The case also highlighted the evolution of forensic science and its impact on cold cases. The genetic genealogy techniques that identified Deborah Jackson would have seemed like science fiction in 1979. The same methods have since been used to solve numerous other cold cases, providing answers to families who had waited decades for resolution. But while Deborah Jackson's identity is now known, her killer remains at large. Investigators are reviewing the case with fresh eyes, hoping that knowing her identity might lead to new clues about her murderer. They're re-examining witness statements from 1979, looking for any mention of Deborah Jackson or anyone she might have associated with in her final days. The investigation now focuses on establishing a timeline of Deborah's last movements. They know she was working in Austin in the weeks before her death, but the details of her final days remain unclear. Who was she with? Where was she staying? And most importantly, who would want to harm her? Investigators are particularly interested in any connections between Deborah and other unsolved murders from the same period. The late 1970s saw several unsolved murders of young women along Interstate 35, leading some to speculate about a possible serial killer operating in the area. While Henry Lee Lucas was not responsible for Deborah's death, someone else might have been targeting vulnerable women in the region. The investigation team began examining similar cases from the late 1970s along the Interstate 35 corridor. One particularly striking parallel emerged with the murder of a young woman found near Temple, Texas, just months before Deborah's death. Like Deborah, she had been strangled and left near the highway. However, DNA testing would later confirm these cases were not connected, highlighting the disturbing reality that multiple predators might have been operating in the area during this period. The identification of Deborah Jackson also led investigators to re-examine the original crime scene evidence with modern techniques. While much of the physical evidence had degraded over the 40 years in storage, advances in forensic science allowed for new analysis of what remained. Trace evidence that had been collected but couldn't be processed in 1979 was now subjected to modern testing methods. One crucial piece of evidence was a single hair found on Deborah's body that didn't match her own. In 1979, hair analysis was largely limited to microscopic comparison, but modern DNA testing could potentially extract useful genetic information. Unfortunately, the hair sample had degraded too much over the decades to yield a complete DNA profile, though partial results suggested it came from a male contributor. Investigators also revisited witnesses from the original investigation who were still alive. A truck driver who had passed through the area on the night of October 30th, 1979, recalled seeing a vehicle parked near the culvert where Deborah's body was found. Though he couldn't identify the make or model in the darkness, he remembered it was a light-colored sedan. This detail had seemed insignificant in 1979, but took on new importance as investigators tried to establish Deborah's final movements. Former employees of the Ramada Inn where Deborah had worked were interviewed again. One remembered her mentioning plans to travel to Dallas, though whether she ever made that trip remains unknown. Another recalled that Deborah sometimes accepted rides from truckers and other travelers, a common but dangerous practice in the era before widespread awareness of serial killers and predators. The investigation also revealed more about Deborah's mental health struggles. Medical records from Abilene showed she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia in her late teens and had periodically received treatment. However, she had stopped taking her medication around the time she left home in 1977. This information helped explain her transient lifestyle, but also suggested she might have been particularly vulnerable to exploitation. One of the most promising new leads came from a woman who contacted investigators after seeing news coverage of Deborah's identification. She had worked at a diner in Georgetown in 1979 and remembered serving a young woman matching Deborah's description on the evening of October 30th. The customer had been accompanied by a middle-aged man who seemed to be controlling the conversation. While this witness couldn't positively identify Deborah from photographs, the timing and location made the encounter significant. Investigators also discovered that several other young women had gone missing from the Austin area during the same period, though none of these disappearances had previously been connected to the Orange Socks case. While some of these women were eventually found alive or their cases were solved, others remained missing. The possibility that these cases might be connected to Deborah's murder added new urgency to the investigation. The team began creating a detailed geographic profile, mapping known locations where Deborah had been seen in her final months. This analysis suggested she had generally stayed within a 100-mile radius of Austin, taking occasional jobs and relying on the kindness of strangers. This pattern might help explain how she came to be in Georgetown on that fatal Halloween night. Cold case investigators also began applying new behavioral analysis techniques to the crime scene evidence. The killer's decision to leave Deborah wearing only the orange socks suggested a possible ritual element to the murder. The location where her body was found, while convenient for disposal, also indicated planning and local knowledge. These factors pointed to someone familiar with the area rather than a passing traveler. The case took another turn when genealogical DNA testing revealed a distant cousin of Deborah's who had lived in Georgetown in 1979. This relative had never known Deborah, but provided valuable information about other family members who had lived in the area. While this lead ultimately didn't identify the killer, It suggested Deborah might have been drawn to Georgetown because she had unknown family connections there. As investigators continued to dig into Deborah's past, they discovered she had been a talented artist, often drawing portraits of people she met during her travels. Some of her sketches were found among her family's belongings, providing poignant glimpses into her life on the road. These drawings also suggested she might have kept a journal or sketchbook that was never recovered, possibly taken by her killer. The team also began examining similar cases that Henry Lee Lucas had falsely confessed to, looking for patterns that might indicate the same perpetrator who killed Deborah. While Lucas had confessed to hundreds of murders, investigators now believe he actually killed fewer than a dozen people. The false confessions had unfortunately prevented proper investigation of many cases, including Deborah's, allowing the real killers to escape justice. The investigation team's focus shifted to examining other similar cases from the same time period that Lucas had falsely confessed to. They discovered a disturbing pattern. Several cases involved young women with transient lifestyles who had been strangled and left near major highways. While not all these cases were necessarily connected, they painted a picture of how vulnerable such women were to predators in the late 1970s. Investigators began building a detailed timeline of the last known sightings of Deborah Jackson. The diner sighting on October 30th became particularly significant. The witness who had come forward remembered specific details about the man accompanying Deborah. He appeared to be in his 40s, had graying hair, and spoke with what she described as a soft Texas drawl. He had paid for both meals in cash and seemed anxious to leave when another customer tried to strike up a conversation with Deborah. The team also discovered that Deborah had made a phone call from a Georgetown gas station on October 30th, though they couldn't determine who she had called. The gas station attendant remembered her because she had asked to use the phone without making a purchase, and he had made an exception to the store's policy. He recalled that she seemed agitated and that after the call, she had waited outside for nearly an hour before a car picked her up. Further investigation into Deborah's time at the Ramada Inn revealed that she had worked there under the name Debbie Davis. This alias might explain why initial attempts to identify her had failed. Co-workers remembered her as someone who kept to herself but was unfailingly kind to others. One former housekeeper recalled that Deborah had once given her a detailed pencil sketch of her young daughter, displaying considerable artistic talent. The team also discovered that Deborah had been briefly hospitalized in Austin in September 1979, just weeks before her death. Hospital records showed she had been treated for exhaustion and released after 2 days. The attending physician's notes mentioned that she had seemed paranoid and had refused to provide contact information for any family members. This was the last official record of her before her death. In reviewing old police reports, investigators found several incidents where patrol officers had encountered Deborah in the weeks before her death. She had been given warnings for hitchhiking and had once been offered a ride to a homeless shelter, which she declined. These encounters painted a picture of someone living on the margins of society, making her an ideal target for a predator. The team also began looking into other businesses along Interstate 35 where Deborah might have sought work. They discovered that several truck stops and motels had employed temporary workers during that period, paying in cash and keeping minimal records. While they couldn't definitively place Deborah at any of these locations, the investigation highlighted how easy it was for someone to move between temporary jobs without leaving a paper trail. One promising lead came from a former truck stop waitress who remembered a regular customer who would often offer rides to young women. She described him as a middle-aged man driving a light-colored Ford sedan, similar to the vehicle seen near the culvert. While she didn't know his name, she recalled that he claimed to be a traveling salesman and would often buy meals for young women who appeared to be hitchhiking or homeless. The investigation also revealed that several items found with Deborah's body had never been fully analyzed. The orange socks themselves, while common, were determined to be from a batch sold primarily at Texas department stores. More significantly, fibers found on the socks matched the carpet commonly used in American-made cars from the mid-1970s, suggesting she had spent time in such a vehicle before her death. As the investigation continued, the team began receiving calls from other women who had encountered dangerous situations while hitchhiking along Interstate 35 during that period. One woman described being picked up by a man matching the description of the diner customer, but managing to escape when he became aggressive. While she couldn't positively identify him 40 years later, her story added to the growing profile of a predator who might have been operating in the area. The team also discovered that several other young women with similar backgrounds to Deborah had disappeared along Interstate 35 between Dallas and San Antonio in the late 1970s. While some of these cases were eventually solved, others remained open. The possibility that these cases might be connected led to the creation of a task force specifically focused on reviewing unsolved murders along the Interstate 35 corridor. Forensic psychologists brought in to review the case suggested that the killer likely had local knowledge and might have worked in a job that allowed him to travel regularly. The specific location where Deborah's body was found, the timing of the murder, and the method of disposal all indicated someone familiar with the area and its patterns of activity. The investigation also revealed that Deborah had likely been killed elsewhere and transported to the culvert. Soil samples from her body didn't match the dump site, suggesting she had been in contact with a different type of soil before her death. This indicated the killer had access to a private location where the murder could take place without discovery. As the case continued to develop, investigators remained hopeful that advances in forensic science might eventually provide the breakthrough needed to identify Deborah's killer. The partial DNA profile obtained from the hair sample was entered into various databases, waiting for a potential match. While the killer's identity remained unknown, the investigation had finally given Deborah Jackson back her name and brought some measure of closure to her family. The case of Deborah Jackson, known for so long only as Orange Socks, serves as both a cautionary tale about false confessions and a testament to the persistence of cold case investigators. While her killer remains unidentified, her story has helped change how law enforcement handles unidentified victims and highlighted the importance of maintaining evidence for future technological advances. Today, Deborah Jackson's case remains active, with investigators continuing to follow new leads and analyze evidence with emerging forensic techniques. Her story has also led to increased attention on other unidentified victims from the same era, as law enforcement agencies work to apply modern investigative methods to decades-old cases. The identification of Deborah Jackson also led to a re-evaluation of similar cases from neighboring counties. Investigators discovered that between 1978 and 1981, there were 6 unsolved murders of young women within a 100-mile radius of where Deborah was found. While not all these cases shared the same signature elements, the geographic and temporal clustering suggested the possibility of a common perpetrator. One case that drew particular attention involved a young woman found near Waco in 1978. Like Deborah, she had been strangled and left near a highway, though she was fully clothed. She was eventually identified as Margaret Collins, a 22-year-old who had also been living a transient lifestyle. While DNA testing would later rule out a direct connection to Deborah's murder, the similarities in victim profile and circumstances were striking. The investigation team also began looking more closely at the orange socks themselves. Advanced fiber analysis revealed that they were manufactured by Burlington Mills and distributed primarily to Texas retailers in early 1979. While this information didn't directly identify the killer, it suggested that either Deborah or her murderer had purchased them locally, further supporting the theory of a killer with ties to the area. More details emerged about Deborah's final weeks alive. A former convenience store clerk in Round Rock, Texas, came forward after seeing news coverage of the case. She remembered Deborah because she would come in almost daily for coffee during early October 1979. The clerk recalled that Deborah often talked about getting a ride to Dallas, where she believed she could find steady work. This information helped establish a more precise timeline of Deborah's movements before her death. The team also discovered that Deborah had been seen at a church-run soup kitchen in Georgetown several times in October 1979. Volunteers remembered her because she would often sketch portraits of other patrons while eating her meal. One volunteer specifically recalled seeing her there on October 29th, just 2 days before her body was found. She had been wearing a denim jacket and carrying a large canvas bag, items that were never recovered. The investigation revealed another crucial detail. Deborah had received a money order for $50 from someone in Abilene shortly before her death. Bank records showed she had cashed it at a Georgetown convenience store on October 28, 1979. The sender's information was no longer available, but this transaction suggested she had maintained some contact with people from her hometown. Investigators also learned more about the circumstances that led to Deborah leaving Abilene in 1977. Former co-workers at the nursing home where she had worked remembered that she had become increasingly paranoid in the months before her departure. She had expressed fears that someone was following her, though at the time, this was attributed to her mental health struggles. In retrospect, investigators wondered if she might have had a legitimate reason to be afraid. The team's geographic profiling efforts yielded interesting results. By mapping all known locations where Deborah had been seen in her final months, they identified a pattern of movement that suggested she was not simply wandering randomly. She appeared to be following a rough circuit between Austin, Georgetown, and Temple, possibly based on where she could find work or shelter. New interviews with truckers who had regularly driven the Interstate 35 corridor in 1979 provided additional context. Several remembered a man who would often be seen at truck stops along the highway, offering rides to young women. He was described as well-dressed and driving a light-colored sedan, similar to previous descriptions. While none could provide a name, their accounts helped establish that a predator might have been actively hunting in the area. The investigation also revealed that Deborah had likely been in the company of at least 2 different men in her final days. Besides the middle-aged man seen with her at the diner, witnesses at the soup kitchen recalled seeing her talking to a younger man described as being in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and a mustache. This individual has never been identified. In reviewing old police reports, investigators found something particularly intriguing. 3 days before Deborah's body was discovered, a patrol officer had responded to a report of a suspicious vehicle parked near the same culvert where she would later be found. The officer had found nothing amiss at the time, but the report suggested the killer might have been scouting the location in advance. The case continues to generate new leads, even decades later. Each new advance in forensic science brings fresh hope that Deborah's killer might finally be identified. While the investigation remains active, it serves as a reminder of both the vulnerabilities that can lead to victimization and the enduring determination of investigators to solve even the coldest of cases.